From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to the show. I'm Ken Davis. There's been a pretty public shouting match going on the past couple of days between two of our show's favorite opinion leaders. Fred Klonsky and George Schmidt are arguing over just how few teachers and other unionized folk are going to vote for Pat Quinn. But Lynn Sweet in the Sun-Times said this week that PQ was glad handing union leaders over in D.C. the other day, and he seemed to be getting a fair amount of support. We've got editorial page editor Tom McNamee with us again today. Tom is here, and we'll talk about that and a few other things. And there's a great picture on the WBEZ website that Al Keefe got hold of. It's an old handwritten pension logbook with a letter from 1927 showing how the state is not keeping up to its promises and the fund is running out of money and something's got to be done about it. And something's just got to be done about it, the promises we keep. Also today, Don Washington's with us. He's he of Mayoral Tutorial, who recently said the following about state policy. I find it very difficult to support tax giveaways for corporate CEOs and millionaire shareholders whose companies pay little in state taxes. I question our priorities when corporate handouts are demanded by companies that don't pay their fair share while middle-class families and taxpayers face an increasing number of burdens. Oh, that's right. I'm getting it confused. That was House Speaker Mike Madigan. It's hard to sort out these lefties sometimes. They all say the same things. So hell has frozen over, and there's no longer any need for mayoral tutorial because the House Speaker and Don Washington completely agree on state policy.
If only he were telling the truth.
Welcome to the show. So, I mean, that actually might be a very interesting place to start. We may lose Archer Daniels Midland. We may not get Boeing if this is what our leaders are saying. That
Do you realize he has not introduced his third guest yet?
I have no idea.
Who, Al Keefe?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, I introduced Al Keefe. Al Keefe from WBEZ. All right, want to be formal about it? Alex Keefe from WBEZ is joining us. Tom McNamee from the Chicago Sun-Times, and Don Washington, formerly of Mayoral Tutorial. But
Formerly?
Well, he's not needed anymore because Mike Madigan has joined the forces. So does this make sense that all of a sudden we're now talking about all the things that a lot of people were complaining about back when it was the CBE and all the others that wanted tax handouts, and now all of a sudden we're against tax handouts for corporations?
I'll just say this because it's just this is like nothing ever just starts this year. For 30 years, maybe 40 years, we've seen the following shift. Taxes away from corporations toward people, taxes away from wealthier people to the middle class. And then we're shocked when that happens that there's not enough revenue to go around to pay for things. So then you also see falling revenue coming in from people, and you also see falling public services. You just see these things. They're just like a domino effect. That kind of thing eventually just leads to a spiral. And so we're now just seeing parts of a spiral. And that's what we're seeing, just parts of a spiral.
But I mean, is Mike Madigan serious about this, or was he just having a weird senior moment or something?
My question from a political standpoint is, why does he bring this up now? I mean, if you look, it wasn't all that long ago that he was calling a special session to talk about gargantuan tax breaks for CME and Sears, and the only thing I could think of is because he lost, because they went to Boca Raton, Florida. Office Depot decided that they were going to leave the state of Illinois. I mean, I don't know, fast forward this movie for me. Is that the only reason he comes out with this right now? From a speaker who doesn't make a lot of public statements, he's not sending out a lot of press releases. This seemed extraordinary.
Yeah. And I think that Archer Daniels Midland effort to get a tax break sort of rubbed him the wrong way and a lot of other people, because the amount they're looking for is so minuscule compared to what they actually do in business, that the idea that somehow they need to get this small tax break, and I wish I could remember the exact amount, but it wasn't great. It was almost like we just want to get a tax break just to get a tax break. And the idea that they would actually pick up and leave the state or not move their corporate headquarters to Chicago for that reason just seemed rather ludicrous. I mean, it would not be a real factor. And I think so it was just a sense of, at some point, a corporation seems to be asking for a handout just because they can.
And because everybody else is getting one.
Yeah,
Well,
so what you need to do, and I don't know, I'm not saying corporate tax breaks are always good or bad. I frankly think that's a debatable question. But you have to make sure they're for real, that there's a real reason to do this, and it's not just a swap. But you're not just throwing money at people who really, you don't need to do that.
Well, I think that there's something else we should really consider here when we talk about, like, why is he doing this now? One, we're talking about it like he means it. And we know that's baloney. We know he's not that guy. He's just not that guy. You said he's not that guy when he's like, he doesn't give many public statements. So really, this is just a political, it's like a pitch. So people can like fight over this nonsense. When in reality, he's got a consistent record, right, of being on the side of large corporations. And it's not as simplistic as either you're giving money to corporations, you're not giving money to the people. It's not that simplistic. It's also not that complicated. 80% of big corporations here in Illinois pay 0 state taxes, according to the Illinois Department of Revenue. Two-thirds of corporations don't pay taxes. 80% of our money that we actually get for the state to spend comes from ordinary citizens. 9% comes from our corporate citizens, and the rest come from like fees. This is according to the state of Illinois. So I would just like it to be, heck, if it was 50-50, that'd be nice. You would see a lot of our state's problems be ameliorated, not disappear, but just be like dealt with. It was just 50-50. We just like took 30% more taxes from the place where the money is pooling. But that's not going to happen. And Mike Madigan is going to make sure that never happens. It's his job.
Okay. All right.
Did we figure it out?
I don't know if we can solve it. I'm just saying that's what he's doing.
I think there's also just a larger issue that, and Barack Obama's made it part of his last 3 years in office, this general sense of the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. And that's for real. And that is very, very real.
Yeah.
And when people say, well, we can't raise taxes, we'll have to, or for instance, unions are a problem or the minimum wage is a problem. There's good argument for all those things. But I was talking to a real top union boss recently who said, unions were the solution when I was growing up, and I still believe in them. But if you think they're no longer the solution, it's not enough to say that hurts. The minimum wage is going to be damaging to the economy. It's not enough to say that higher tax rates is going to be damaging to the business economy. If you want to make that argument, fine. But if that's not going to be the solution, what is the solution? Because no one can deny that there's a growing gap between the wealthy and the
Chasm.
and the rest of us.
Yeah.
Have you folks read the Pearson report on that stuff?
No.
So I think everyone should Jacob Hacker and his partner Pearson, whose last name I forget. They wrote a fantastic report which talk about the concentration of money. And the thing to think about is that, and this is really pretty straightforward stuff. Let's say that we're all that Ken is a multi-millionaire, and he has more money to spend on public policy, just does. As he gets more money to defend his priorities, right, his prerogatives, then as rules loosen, he begins to extend more force, right?
That sounds good so far.
To not just protect what he has, but to expand what he can get. Well, the rest of us, right, we lose the capacity over time to even impact politics. And so you begin to see a thing where it's not just the top 1% has gotten more money compared to the rest of us, but the real action in this stuff is like in the top 1/10 of the 1%. Those cats have shot up they have shot up so far that you have CEOs that make like 235 times what like their lowest paid worker makes.
Do you know, I saw a statistic in a letter that I think could be in the paper, the Sun-Times today. I was editing the letters, and I came across a guy who threw out a statistic that says the top CEO of McDonald's makes what he makes in 1 hour would take 3.5 months for his minimum wage or lowest paid worker to make. And I thought, that can't be. So, you better check out your facts before you put it in the paper. It's true.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's true. He makes $9,000 an hour.
And it's not the thing that's amazing, but it's not that uncommon, and that's what we have to realize.
And of course there have been I don't know how we got down this road, but there have been these great debates going on about what would be the impact if McDonald's doubled the rate for every employee, including the CEO, if they doubled everybody's salary, the cost of a Big Mac would go up about 35 cents or something like that. But the argument that I found interesting, the economist's argument against it was, yeah, but the problem you have is that McDonald's really just has held off on investing in automation equipment. And what would happen is they would keep the price, the labor price exactly where it is and fire half the staff.
Automation equipment at McDonald's.
No, I think that's true, actually.
An automation equipment. I want you to think about a McDonald's assembly line. Just think about it. So are you assuming there's going to be like a conveyor belt that runs in a little tiny spot, and then there's going to be a little machine that does?
The bottom line is,
that?
as much as
Really?
I understand the value of a minimum wage, and I have often argued for it in different places, I don't think it's honest to say there is no negative impact on a business if you increase the minimum wage.
I disagree.
No, I know you do, but I think it's just a question
wrong.
of balancing the pros and the cons. But to say that it's all good and that the average hardware store owner, for instance, I'm thinking about a particular hardware store I go to, a little small mom and pop place, that this wouldn't be an effect on them, I think it would. And I think we just have to be, I think, with all respect, I think we go farther in the argument about why minimum wage might be valid if we acknowledge that it's not all good. There's a downside to any public policy, and I think that would be one.
I agree. I agree with the concept that every
done.
public policy has a good side and a bad side. It does.
I just know that mathematically, when you look at every time minimum wage has been increased, it has not led to mom and pop stores going out of business at a rapid clip. It just hasn't happened. What's happened is that people's base incomes have gone up.
And then there's more money for the economy.
That's right.
and
That's
all
what's
that.
happened.
Yeah, but that's standard. Everybody should make $1,000 an hour, and we'd all be rich. And I don't.
But it doesn't work that way.
I know
That's
it
just
doesn't. This
glib,
is
and
my point.
it's not true.
No, but this is my point. The argument, well, if everybody made more money, that'd be more money in the economy, and everything goes up. Now I'm sounding like a Republican, but frankly, the reality of life is that there's valid arguments on both sides, and this is a perfect example. To raise the minimum wage to some extent might be a net good, okay? Which is why papers like the Sun-Times tend to argue for that. But to deny that at some point it can be counterproductive, I think it's just. I'd have to see your studies, but I'm sure I can find 6 studies that say the opposite of what yours say. And common sense says at some point, maybe not $10, maybe 15, but at some point there has to be downside to increasing the minimum wage.
No, you're right. There is a. I'm going to try and not be too wonky. There is a point where the wage structure, if it's too high at the bottom, it actually drives out things. But the question is, what is a living wage? Right? What can the economy bear as a living wage? What do the demands that we put on people with housing and clothing and food, what is that? Right? And then that tells you what you need to actually allow people to make in order to survive in society. And we are nowhere near that by any stretch of the imagination.
I really want to kind of move on to a couple of other things, but something that's always fascinated me about that is the idea that I've never quite understood why let's say a hamburger chain that's not doing as well doesn't say, well, we're going to pay more money and we're going to get a more devoted and dedicated staff. We're going to increase the internal, I don't know what you call it, morale inside the individual stores, and we are going to kick up our ability to be a better competitor.
It depends on the business. There's a guitar store in Lincoln Avenue where they do just that. You know what I'm talking about? Just north of Belmont Avenue here in Chicago.
I know.
Right across the bakery, great place.
Yeah.
And he pays well over what everybody else pays his folks. And of course, it's a guitar store. They're all guitar players. But he has this incredible loyalty, and because of that, I think the whole vibe of that place and the expertise of the people they have there is much, much better. And I think he's rewarded for being an enlightened employer who pays more.
Yeah.
But I don't know. But I think you sort of have to look at the particular business to know if that's true or not.
Yeah.
I mean, my experience with places like McDonald's, it's what matters more than whether you pay them $1 more, $1 less, in terms of the esprit de corps, not in terms of whether they can live off it. But esprit de corps, it's just the attitude of the people at the top.
Individual.
Yeah. If you go to what's that Subway shop? I can't remember it. There's one in town where everybody's always like smiling. I turned to my kids and said, they've got a boss who has the right attitude. But that's.
Yeah.
I'm going off on
Speaking of bosses and
Attitudes.
money and salaries and all that, it gets us to this pension history thing, Mr. Keefe. You did I must say, a very good piece of reporting the other day on the history of pensions in Illinois. We've been debating this thing forever, but it was so interesting to hear sort of a deep dive going back into the 1890s, right?
1880s, yeah.
1880s.
I did a story about the state pension system that was similar to this around this time last year, and the thing that just never ceases to surprise me is old news, which is that this has been around a long time. But not just that, but people have known about this and have been documenting it and have been making a lot of noise about it for decades and decades and decades and decades.
About the fact that we're going to go bust.
About the fact that, if what Ken is referring to is I was sitting down with the secretary of the Chicago Firefighters Pension Fund, and he has these old handwritten books, and some of them have been typed out. And we're talking back to 1924 and 1927. They're sending letters to Springfield saying, hey guys, this pension math you have is wacky. We're going to go broke by 1930.
Really?
Absolutely.
And we really need you to increase and change the way you fund pensions. And when you talk to pension experts, investors, union leaders, politicians today, you hear the same kind of stuff. It's not the entire reason for the funding is not the entire reason for Chicago's pension reason, but it is a uniquely quirky piece of math. I haven't been able to find anything else like this in the entire country.
Thing.
Yeah, it is, and it's basically what it is for the city of Chicago is they in order to figure out how much the city pays, they take a look at how much employees contribute 2 years prior, okay, and they times that by a number that's fixed in state law, and that's it. That's how much the city pays. Now, I'm not good at math.
So it's
I'm
2
terrible
years
at
ago. It's based on what was happening 2 years ago.
Right, and the thing is that multiplier will change a little bit based on salaries changing, but what doesn't change is it doesn't adjust if there's huge swings, if there's a market crash, if there's thousands of early retirements like there were in 1998 and 2004, if benefits increase, if something happens that changes the amount of money going out the door, right now that thing stays the same. And that multiplier hasn't increased since 1982. It's been sitting there. So again, that's not the whole reason for Chicago's pension crisis. You can't point to any one reason, but with certain funds, police and fire in particular, that is a gigantic reason. They've never been funded properly. And what's amazing to me from a normal Joe on the street perspective is you look at these documents and it doesn't take a math whiz to figure out that the math doesn't make sense. But from an amateur historian perspective, it's been going on for decades and people have been talking about it. This isn't a surprise.
And also you something that I hadn't realized is that these pensions are selling off their assets too. I mean, it's sort of like Detroit having to sell its art museum or something.
Right, it is a little bit like that, and that's something that's not unusual for public pensions. Public pensions plans will sell off some of the money they're supposed to be investing during down years. What's bad is the trend, and since 2000, the rate at which Chicago's four pension funds are liquidating assets has tripled. And last year they cashed out $1 billion in investments. And basically what I said in my story is it's like eating yourself to stay alive. This is a bad cycle to get into. And again, that's not necessarily news. It's pretty easy math to do, but it shows you what dire condition the pension funds are in right now.
So, and then when you add to that the pension holidays, which have
affected some of the funds, yeah.
Rahm is he's asking to take one right now. That's what he wants. He wants a pension holiday. We don't want to pay in.
He wants to have a break from this gigantic spike that they're paying in 2015.
Which exists because of the pension holidays
That's right.
that were given in years prior.
Right.
So I think we had Fred Klonsky on the show yesterday, and he said, last week, and he said something to the effect that the Democrats have cut everything that they can find, and we're the last thing standing, and so now they're going to take money away from us that
we being the public workers.
We being the public workers who are contractually obligated and so forth, which of course gets us to that point of the Supreme Court and whether the Supreme Court's going to uphold all of this.
That's going to be interesting. I think a couple things for us to just noodle around as we think about this stuff. It's instructive, right, that it seems like whenever you check, pension funds are always about to die. It's just an instructive piece of history. It's always a crisis. It's always a crisis. And when it's not a crisis, people take holidays, right? So which leads to another crisis.
That's what happened in Chicago.
So something to consider, just how pensions work, right? It's a big pool of money, right? We pool it all together. It takes decades to to pay out, it takes decades to pay in. And because of the nature of how pensions pay out and pay in, as long as you have people paying some money in, right? There's always more bodies running around. As long as there's more bodies, so more workers than there are people leaving, and as long as there are people paying money in, the odds of a pension going bust, like just running out of funds, not big.
Well, I think one of the things that struck me, Al, about your piece is that one thing that is new now that we haven't seen before is this massive baby boom retirement thing.
Yeah, that's right.
Demographically speaking, we're in a different territory than we've been in the past, right?
That's a huge part of it. I mean, I want to reiterate too, the multiplier piece with public safety funds is a huge reason they're in bad shape. They've never been properly funded. Going back to the 70s, the fire fund had 40% of the money it needed. Some of the other funds, though, in the early 2000s, as Don points out, when the booze is flowing, nobody's thinking about closing time.
So
as
I guess
one
my
guy
question
put it
is
to me.
this: so in 1930s, 1940s, were the pension funds would they have been as assessed as being as in dire shape as they are now?
If you ask the pension funds themselves, based on the documents I've seen, yes. And the funding mechanism was not then exactly the same as it is today. But based on the documents that I saw, it was.
So why didn't they go bust?
That's a good question. Why it didn't
Well,
go bust?
they didn't go bust because of the way that money is paid.
Yeah, I understand. I understand. People have to pay more into it, but is it possible they would go bust more likely now because circumstances are different than they were in 1930 and 40? For instance, my generation, the baby boomer generation, is this army of retirees coming along, and there simply aren't enough human beings in the workforce behind them to.
You mean would it actually go bust if they didn't do
Well,
anything about it?
theoretically, it can't go bust. But although there was that ruling, the federal court ruling now says you can in fact go bust. So.
Right. I don't
allow you to.
I mean, because frankly, what I'm hearing here is utterly, completely different from what I've been hearing from every single pension expert, left, right, or in the middle, for the last 2 years. And what they've been saying is that this is a real crisis. The pension fund is in fact dramatically underfunded. There's no getting around it, regardless of the historical precedent that you're citing, and that if we don't come to terms with it, the money will not be there. And we can't look the other way and say, well, it's just a question of people come behind, they'll pay into it, it'll be fine. It won't be fine.
Yeah.
I don't think that's different than what I found.
I got something. I just want to ask a question here because it's just about like how pensions. It's a question about how pensions work. When we talk about pension funds going bust, are we talking about paying in the liabilities for the pension, or are we talking about pensions as a percentage of the state?
I think we're talking
GDP?
about the
What are
amount
we
of.
talking
We're
about?
talking about the fund having enough money to pay the pensions of the people who are currently retired, and making sure there's enough money to pay the pensions of people going along. You can project these things. It's not.
Right, but if you use actuarial projections and you base it
And
on
based on actuarial projections, what everybody has said repeatedly, constantly, left, right, and
But
in the
that's-
middle, which is why it's finally coming to terms. What's finally come is that in fact, if you look at actuarial projections, the amount of money that we will have to pay pensions if we did nothing for people in the year 2040 to 2030, it's just not going to be there.
No,
and
but
I don't know about your
it's-
1930s, but nobody's, even the unions don't deny that. What they argue, in fact, is well, we'll just have to pay more money into the system. We'll have to, we'll have to raise taxes if necessary. We'll have to do that.
Well, see,
Right, Ken? Am I missing something?
that's
here?
what
think
we have to do.
But that's the part that really gets me going, is that when you look back over the last 20 or 30 years, the piece that's missing consistently is that the governments have not paid the part that they were obliged to do.
They just never paid it.
Right.
In almost every case, the union members have paid in their share,
That's right.
but the government has found
Never.
a way not to pay their share.
No, and now the union
So-
people who pay their share are getting screwed. There's no question about it.
And somehow or other, we all seem to be sort of collectively looking to the side and saying, "Oh well, I guess that's what we have to do. We're just going to have to take this away from them."
But
I've never found that to be just. But of course, then the question is, well,
It's
how
not
do you
just.
fix that?
It's
How
not,
do-
I don't think
it's
the
either
argument.
just or fair.
I don't think the argument of being just or fair is even debatable. It's not just. It's not fair. The question is, what's your alternative?
What do you
so,
do?
what do you think is the alternative?
Well, I mean, there are people who say that we have to figure out a different tax structure. We have to find a way to get revenue from places we haven't found it before.
I think we're going to have to do that anyway.
I mean, we have to do that for
all
everyone.
governments only do they tax, they spend, and they set the priorities for infrastructure, and they set the rules of the road for how we behave with each other. That's all government. That's all the powers they have. So our only power is to fix the pension pieces. The only power we have is through how we tax and spend. That's the only power we have to fix it. Now we can decide that we're not going to pay, right? We're just not going to pay.
Which is what they decided.
Right? That's what we've decided. So
Yeah.
if we decide that, then what we've really done, and this is just a straightforward deal. What we've really decided is we're going to have less public services now and less public services in the future, because the reason why you become a teacher or a firefighter is that, one, you want to do it because you want to give the service, but two, you take less money for the work, that's for the danger of the work, or for the amount of years you have to go to school. You take less money because you know that when you retire, when you leave, you're going to be rewarded, right, with money that you paid in. You're going to have a stable retirement. You're not going to be rich. You're not going to have an island with sharks going around it, but you are.
I think
going to be
you make a good point.
not happening.
I think you make a good point, which is one of the reasons people like public jobs, is because there's a dependable, reliable idea that you're going to get a decent pension at the end of it.
Yeah.
And I think that will be hurt by this. No
And
question.
these are people who have been public servants in many cases for 30, 40 years, and
Yeah.
we owe them a debt of thanks.
But
I
it's
think.
not just them. We also owe the society that we live in. You get the society you pay for.
Yeah.
You know, I
And
know it
but
all
I
sounds
wanna-
great,
but-
and this goes back.
But
to,
I want to say this. I want to stress this to you guys. As a percentage of gross domestic product of the state, our pensions are like point. Oh, if they're
They're
0.19, they're
small. Yeah.
small. So if we actually restructured our tax, if we actually dealt with our tax structure, we could easily fix this.
Don, we got a minute. We got a minute left. I can't believe that we do, but the Supreme Court. It's all in the Supreme Court's hand now. What's your educated opinions? You get a few seconds each. Is the Supreme Court going to uphold this the pension legislation now?
I have no idea what the Supreme Court's going to do.
there's an honest man.
There's the honest man at the table.
You know, let me put it this way. I don't think anybody can answer that question. The question is, will they resolve it on its merits or for politically?
Right.
The
I guess that
Illinois
really
Supreme
was
Court
the
is a
question.
political
Yeah.
body.
Right.
And the question for me is not so much what they'll do, but what'll be what'll be the calculation in whatever they do. You know, on the one hand, they may say it's not constitutional. On the other hand, they may say, but you know what? Politically, we need to do this. That may be the way they look at this.
yeah.
So it's hard to say.
Don, can you answer in 10 seconds?
Sure. I have no
9,
idea. I have no idea
8.
what they're going to do, and whatever they do, the explanation will be much more entertaining than what they actually do.
And that is the case. By the way, thanks to Tom McNamee and the Chicago Sun-Times for providing the refreshments today. Went over to Panhellenic Bakery on the way here, brought these cookies.
Can't beat Greektown.
Thank you so much, Tom.
I love this
Alex
guy.
Keefe,
too, I
WBEZ. Tom McNamee, editorial page editor of the Chicago Sun-Times. Don Washington, Mayoral Tutorial. Thank you all for being here today. We didn't resolve a darn thing, but we'll try again next week if you'll give us another shot. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. Of course, you can see us all the time on CAN TV, and at any time you like by going to this little address right here, and you can hear Mr. Washington's explanations all for yourself and watch them again because they're complicated. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks for watching us. We'll see you next week on Chicago Newsroom. Bye.